Hello and welcome to the Dissidents Podcast, part of the Institute for Liberal Values. This is where we discuss how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. In this week's podcast, we'll begin the first of a two-part series on a concept called the Dark Triad. This is a theoretical concept from personality psychology. It is comprised of three traits: Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy. In this episode, we'll explore the link between socio-political extremism, such as alt-right ideology, as well as authoritarian political correctness, and the Dark Triad. This will serve as a basis for part two, in which we will be looking at how the same Dark Triad traits may be linked to virtue signaling. When this occurs, well-meaning people might allocate their material and social resources to people who are neither victims nor virtuous, rather than those who actually need them. Okay, hello everybody. Today we're going to be talking about the concept of the Dark Triad. Sounds deeply scary, and maybe it is deeply scary, actually. This is not a criminal organization. The Dark Triad refers to three negative or largely negative personality traits that certain individuals can manifest. Now, obviously, we have our resident psychologist, Elizabeth Spivak, with us. So I'll just introduce the names of these concepts, and then I will let her do a far better job than I'm capable of defining exactly what they are. But as they're traditionally defined, we have Machiavellianism, named after the allegedly manipulative Italian philosopher, although I think that's a bit of an injustice. He was more pragmatic than manipulative, and not really a bad sort, but it certainly infers the negative kind of manipulative side. Narcissism, looking in the mirror, being in love with oneself is the naive kind of the common parlance of narcissism, but there's deeper psychological meaning to that. And finally, psychopathy, which in the common parlance is kind of very aggressive, unfeeling kind of behavior. But again, there's deeper consideration that we need to pay to each of those concepts. So if I can hand it over to you, Elizabeth.
As you know, I didn't really want to do this. You've been pushing me to do this Dark Triad thing for a while.
Sorry.
And personality stuff in general for a while. And I've been resisting. And one of there's several reasons why I've been resisting. And I think it's important to maybe discuss those real quick, and they may reappear as we talk.
Of course.
First, so one of the issues that I have with this is in part just demonstrated by the way that you introduced it, which is that, these are negative personality traits. And I object to that a little bit in that there's just simply no negative that all
That's
of
because
these,
you're too nice.
All personality traits have positive aspects of them, all of them. And so, while you even, said, Machiavellianism, named after Machiavelli, perhaps maybe not such a bad guy, more pragmatic and so all of these are on a continuum, right? So, and they're not even a bipolar, you could, not all of them are necessarily like low to high. We might think about other personality traits like conscientiousness or openness to experience or you mentioned agreeableness in your email to me. We manifest these even in different, we manifest different personality aspects of our personality, even in different situations. So to suggest that we have, one stable personality that, that sort of reveals or rears its ugly head in the case of a dark triad, the way you described it, in every situation would be, I think, belied by most research and stuff. So I was sort of pushing back against this because when I have done consulting work and we, handed out personality scales or even the traditional sort of, what's your work personality, the more, fun ones and stuff. The idea typically is to get people to respect others' differences, right? And what seems more likely to happen is that people divide themselves based on these things. Well, you are a whatever, and I am this other thing. And people actually don't work together better. They often, instead of trying to collaborate and figure out how to work with somebody, they often just say, well, we're never going to understand each other because you have a different personality or a different type of thinking style than I do. So we'll keep coming back to this, where I'm always going to say that there are advantages to all of these things, that some of these personality traits have advantages that might not be immediately obvious, and that without all of these differences, these nuances, we'd have a pretty boring society, and we wouldn't have anyone to take risks, for example, like create risks that most of us think are nuts. We need a certain number of people who are willing to take those risks. Those might be people who score high on psychopathy because their physiological response to risk is much lower. And so they don't break out in a sweat. They don't start, breathing heavy. Their heart doesn't race when they're doing something that's high risk. And that's a good thing if you're, if you need fighter pilots or if you need people who are going to go into space, if you're going to take firefighters, exactly, police officers, that kind of thing. So I don't think there's a strict cutoff where we'd say, oh, if you score, like a specific score, then that's bad for society, right? And even if we knew this, one of the things that when I teach my classes and stuff, people often want to suggest that there's a certain personality type or certain neurological things that would be associated with criminal behavior, for example. And one of the things I like to ask people is, even if that were true, what would we do with that? So let's just say that we could, say, oh, there's this personality, this interesting, predictive, construct of different personality traits that predict something negative. Exactly what would we do with it? Would we test everyone in society on this whatever magical scale that we have, right? And
assuming we could invent one, right?
Assuming we could invent one, right? Which there isn't one. Then we would test everyone and we would put them we would say, oh, you're at risk. We're going to prophylactically either survey you, put you under surveillance, or maybe even incarcerate you because you scored so high or so low on something. And so that, therefore, to protect society, right? Of course, we can't do that. We can't know people's personality, even sometimes when we think we do. A lot of times it's situational responses, that's bringing out or accentuating a particular aspect of someone's personality. Or even, remember, people are not things, right? When we are observing people, they are observing us at the same time. And so it's a dynamic. And so we're also sort of bringing out, particular aspects of someone's personality when we interact with them in ways. So anyway, I think this is very sort of enticing. Something called the Dark Triad, right? I mean, that's a very enticing kind of thing. And certainly we have two. We're only going to really talk a lot about one article, which is quite short, but we had the other one too. And I think that, again, these are there's some evidence here that's interesting and fun to talk about. But I just want to make sure that we honor and respect the wonderful variability of humanity.
Of course, because to do otherwise would be fundamentally illiberal, right?
Yes.
Just because somebody scores in having a certain set of values doesn't mean that we can therefore assume that they're going to be, of no help or fundamentally evil or anything like that. That would contradict the principle of individuality, which would be fundamentally illiberal. And I also like the fact, and this is really important because I always try and do the same with ideology, right? Ideology being my bag, psychology being yours. John Stuart Mill once said that if you can't give a really, really good account of your opponent's position, then you have no business essentially arguing with your opponent, right? You've got to really understand the strengths as well as the weaknesses of their argument. It's no good just understanding the weaknesses, So you can see, for example, it's quite readily obvious why psychopathy could manifest negative behaviors. But if you can't also understand the flip side of that, for example, that we, as you suggested, our society can't function if there aren't people like soldiers or firefighters who are disproportionately more likely to take risky behavior, and many of them would measure as psychopaths. And it doesn't mean that they're going to then go home and go on a shooting rampage. The vast majority of psychopaths don't do that, pay taxes, are law-abiding citizens, and would think that that kind of behavior is awful. I get that. And the kind of pigeonholing and boxing people, by saying, okay, so you score high on, for example, psychopathy, and that therefore makes you a bad person because some psychopaths would behave in this way, is a kind of categorization akin to racism, which is another kind of gross repudiation of individualism and really the kind of thing that we're absolutely against. Let's go into the personality traits in a bit more depth. So we've looked at psychopathy. So as we understand psychopathy, it is so there's psychopathy and sociopathy, right? Sociopathy being the learned variable and psychopathy being innate. Is that correct? Or is that kind of like a full dichotomy?
Yeah, I think it is.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is. Yeah. I do think that, mostly in psychology, researchers have focused on the aspects of psychopathy that are related to behavioral activation systems and behavioral inhibition systems. So that's probably sort of why you kind of get the idea that, learned versus innate. And I don't know that the line is that clear, but certainly, there is evidence that based on very, very small sample sizes, okay, that people who are score high in psychopathy also seem to be overly responsive to rewards and seem to, really overly responsive to rewards and seem to have pretty high tolerance for risk. So they focus so much on the rewards sometimes that they will continue to take risks even when they're losing at sort of a gambling game and that kind of stuff. Even something as simple as, getting a candy bar or whatever, they'll take much higher risks and focus so hard on the risks that they don't learn the punishment. So they seem to be more tolerant of punishment and or do not learn, the punishment signals all that well. So, in terms of our, my example of, sort of not, heart not racing and that kind of stuff. I mean, most of us, if we had to break into, even if we're breaking into our own house, right, because we locked ourselves out, or it's like we're afraid that somebody's going to call the cops because they might see us trying to break into our own house and that kind of thing, where maybe somebody who scores high in psychopathy doesn't get those internal signals that we do that would make us afraid, to do something that's even perfectly okay So yeah, I think that, we get this disinhibition, together with a lack of remorse, maybe callousness, a disregard for social norms. Those are kind of the things that we might associate with, with psychopathy. But let me just say also that most teenagers score quite high in psychopathy. So pretty much any teenager,
is a psychopath,
including us, probably. Right.
Well, I mean, okay, let's look at the positive and the negative there. So, for example, for us, psychopathy would be needed to stand up to critical social justice bullies. We know that they're out there. Sometimes somebody who is willing to take a big risk and stand up to these people, maybe, that might be an adaptive quality there in psychopathy, somebody who's actually willing to take a fight.
And again, this is like, what's high and what's low and that kind of stuff, depends on the scale and everything that's used. There's even a couple or three scales in even the articles that we looked at here. The Hare psychopathy checklist is sort of a standard, and that requires an actual interview. The articles we're going to talk about here, they answered like 4 questions, so that's very different than, something that's a clinical interview based scale. So we just have to remember that the participants in a study like this are from the normal population, just everyday people who answered a few questions about how they self-reported, how they feel about themselves, right? And so I think there's one argument to be made that people who, when they answer something, that's maybe negative, and I actually pulled up a couple of if we need them, I have a couple of the scales, like, sitting on my computer here if we need to look at them. But that if they're willing to admit that they maybe manipulate or take advantage of others, or don't care about other people or whatever, that maybe the people on that extreme are maybe even more likely to be that extreme, because there is even on something that's maybe they think is anonymous, there's this, social desirability that's even when we're sitting alone answering a survey, that we know that people don't value that, right? So if you're willing to say that, you must really be, willing to admit that. And, and that's one of the complaints about something like an authoritarianism scale in general, or a racism scale, or a scale about attitudes about immigrants or something like that, that there is this social desirability factor that would prohibit people from responding. So you're really only capturing the few people who are at the extremes, because those are the people who are not responsive to social norms, right? So I think, there's value in even a self-report, perhaps if you look at it from that perspective. And then the neuroticism, the sort of self-grandiosity and sort of the prestige-driven. Were you going to say something else about
narcissism? You mean?
Yeah, narcissism.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So that's another. I think that again, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but the article that we were going to talk about also included an entitlement scale. And when I looked that scale up, the overlap with narcissism was, pretty, very, very similar, very, very similar questions. Narcissism and this sort of entitlement. I can't remember exactly what, right this second. The psychological entitlement scale. So that's 9 items. I honestly just feel I'm more deserving than others was their example. And that's, a little bit, the overlap between narcissism and the psychological entitlement was pretty high, I thought, in the questions. So what are your thoughts about narcissism?
Well, I'm not qualified to talk about it in the same depth that you are. again, my thing being ideology, I understand. However, when I have come up against, real critical social justice advocates, not necessarily the scholars, by the way, like the people who really, really get it usually aren't like this, but the real kind of the advocates really, I think it's really, 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 really important to distinguish even if they're both academics, right? So they're, let's say person A is an advocate and person B is a scholar, but they're both academics working in a prestigious university. Sometimes these are working at the top universities, and academic A may be an advocate, right? So he or she their whole identity is constructed around the ideology, or at least their version of the ideology. But they often, and these are the pathological ones I want to talk about, they seldom seem to know their own literature in any significant depth, and often seem to be seizing upon little nuggets of it that justify their behavior. And I think...
So overconfidence, like I just wanted to read a couple of the,
sure.
I tend to want others to admire me. I tend to want others to pay attention to me. I tend to seek prestige or status.
Yeah.
I tend to expect special favors from others. Those are some, examples, from, the narcissism aspect. People see me as a natural leader.
Oh, yeah.
Many group activities tend to be dull without me. I know that I'm special because everyone keeps telling me so. I have been compared to famous people. So that's some of the items.
Right. So, what I want to draw a big distinction, because I think that these, perhaps in an anecdotal way, if you don't think that the evidence stacks up here, but anecdotally, it seems to fit quite well. Again, not the scholars. I know people who are scholars in critical race theory who would say that, all of the bullying, the ideological bullying that's going on, it's real, it's happening, it's a misportrayal of what they would view as the key points of their literature, and they would condemn that kind of behavior. Some of them do.
I think
so the scholars don't tend to behave like that.
I think, to use your argument on, the same argument you used in psychopathy, I think that you need to have a certain amount of psychological entitlement and a certain amount of narcissism in order to fight back against some of this too, right? In order to write articles that, like the ones, that we're going to look at today, you have to feel as though you have something to contribute, and sometimes you have to feel that way in spite of, I say evidence. I use the term, arguments against you. And so there's maybe a certain amount of narcissism that is productive, right? That keeps you, pushing against, forces that would try to tamp you down. So just, again, to continue our argument that there's good and bad, and that there's usefulness, on both sides.
This is probably an oversimplification, but I think it works as a heuristic to kind of understand the point that we're making. And I think we talked to Spencer about it in the podcast on patriotism, in which he made the point that, okay, look, we all know that patriotism can go way too far, become jingoistic. There are lots of historical examples. Just, look at the Nazis and what they did. We know that that's bad. But there might also be a deficiency, right? A deficiency of patriotism, that you feel no connection to the place in which you live, and therefore your community, and therefore you don't really have that kind of contextual anchor that all human beings need in order to function within whatever society it is they exist, right? And so he suggested that there's a sweet spot, right? Mm-hmm. Aristotle called this the doctrine of the mean in his book Nicomachean Ethics, which is the middle, right? Where you have an anchor, you have a sense of appreciation for your society and the people who came before you that built it and all of the great things that they did. But you can also criticize it You can also look at the bad things that happen. You can look at slavery in the sense of America, and you could appreciate how awful that was. And you could look at the bad things that America might be doing right now and be able to criticize them, if nothing else, so as to build a better society, right? So you don't want to be at the deficiency or the excess.
But you got to have enough to keep you going, right?
But it's really interesting because, but then within a society, so for example, let's say we have a society like a social context like the one within which we both operate, which is academia, where you'd say, okay, critical social justice ideology is probably not dominant amongst most people in their own internal headspace, but it's become dominant because there are very few people who are willing to stand up against it, sorry. And so in that sense, you would want individuals who are perhaps a little bit towards the excessive side, right? A little bit excessive on narcissism, a little bit excessive on psychopathy. And maybe if, the people that we're going up against the Machiavellian as well, maybe then we need to break the rules as well. So maybe all of those traits are desirable in pushing back. Not even desirable, maybe necessary.
Necessary, right. Because Machiavellianism would be the more, sort of manipulative, exploitive, power-based aspect of this, right? Where, I'm the smartest, let's get rid of all the other smart people. Right.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. I'm the prettiest, but get rid of all the pretty people. And so yeah, I think that a little, the sort of competitive power-based aspect of that also needed, somebody's got to step up, right? So do we want to actually sort of, the article is actually entitled "The Dark Triad Traits Predict Authoritarian Political Correctness and Alt-Right Attitudes." And the authors measured some demographics, which I don't want to stop without talking about the demographics. So we can go back to that at the end. They used something called the short dark triad, and that was some of the questions that I had read off with regard to narcissism. But some of the questions for Machiavellianism. I like to use clever manipulation to get my way. It is wise to keep track of information so that you can use it against people later. You should wait for the right time to get back at people. There are things you should hide from other people to preserve your reputation. Make sure your plans benefit yourself, not others. Most people can be manipulated. So that's some of the Machiavellian questions. And I think that, again, just as you mentioned, using some of the manipulation, works on both sides. So the authors of this paper, I should have read Jordan Moss and Peter O'Connor. And this was, what year was this? 2020. So they used the short dark triad, the psychological entitlement scale, which I think I have a couple of items on that one, if you're interested. I do have to put on my glasses to read this one. Holy cow. I honestly feel I'm just more deserving than others. Great things should come to me. If I were on the Titanic, I would deserve to be on the first lifeboat. I demand the best because I'm worth it. I do not necessarily, that one's reverse quote. I deserve more things in my life. People like me deserve extra break now and then. Things should go my way. I feel entitled to more of everything. So that's some items on that scale. Then this political correctness scale, and they only offer the 2 items. Yeah. I could not get this scale because it's part of someone's dissertation. It has never been, get it. It's never been published as far as I know. So this is just, a student's dissertation item, but that's important to note because it's an unpublished scale. It probably hasn't been they certainly list the reliabilities here, and I don't question them, but it hasn't been tested, over many studies. So they have two subscales of this political correctness scale. One is political correctness authoritarianism. So we can call that, PC authoritarianism. And then political correctness liberalism. So PC liberalism. So they do list just two example items, which is the best that we can offer the listeners. An example of PC liberalism item would be: there's no biologically based differences in personality, talent, and ability to reason between racial groups.
Right, individualism, in other words.
Right. And then PC authoritarianism, one item is: when a charge of sexual assault is brought forth, the alleged perpetrator should have to prove his or her innocence.
Right, which is kind of standpoint epistemology. I can make claims. My claims have to be accepted on face value. Certainly, political correctness authoritarianism has come hand in hand with narcissism, with the, again, not the scholars, but the advocates, who, again, often they're academics who invest their identity in this, but they really pick and choose items of the ideology that they can use, usually for bolstering their own status and bullying. I can give examples of political correctness authoritarianism. I've used it on this podcast before. This is one of my favorite ones, and this is a real life one that I came up against. Somebody that I think it very much is a narcissist. And that person would say something, they'd write out a whole kind of things alleging various, this person made a microaggression here, and 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 here. And I don't know what was inside that person's brain. Maybe they did intend the offense. Maybe they didn't. They weren't given an opportunity to defend themselves. So I just don't know, right? Nevertheless, after this person wrote this big spiel, the next few lines were, that was really difficult to write. I'm exhausted and emotionally drained after writing this. I would appreciate some validation. And this is kind of in the language of critical social justice. And this is something that this person had learned because it's a behavior that is common within these circles. They're constantly asking each other for validation. I need validation. It's almost a manner. You never question, query, or even try to qualify any experience that they say they have had. You must immediately validate everything that they've said to the fullest extent that they've said it, or even more. And I've seen in my own life on a number of occasions coming up against these people, I have seen, what I would regard as people who, I'm not a psychologist, but I would be willing to bet if a psychologist was to put them on the couch and, put them through their paces, would very, very likely get a clinical diagnosis of narcissism. Because that exists, right? A clinical diagnosis of narcissism. Yeah. There is a clinical diagnosis for narcissism and psychopathy, but not for Machiavellianism, so far as I understand it.
And not from these scales.
No, not from these scales, no. Yeah. And I'm not trying to say that these people have a clinical diagnosis, and I'm not even saying who they are. I'm simply saying that if I were a psychologist, if I could put them in front of a psychologist, I would be surprised if they didn't receive that clinical diagnosis. Because what I've seen with these people in a number of contexts is going into spaces. Let's use the critical social justice term, right? So they have spaces for Black people, as if Black people needed a space, which I think is a kind of racist assertion, but never mind. Or spaces for gay people, as if gay people needed a space. Again, same point. But anyway, they will often enter into spaces despite not being of the, for them, required, sexual persuasion or ethnic identity. And they will very quickly, especially this happens when you have this with academics who are going into student spaces, they will quite quickly use their power status as an academic, as somebody who's at a university, for example, to make everything about them. So an example that I'm aware of that happened at a university that my friend, not me, a friend worked at, a gay student was going to make a presentation on a certain topic related to LGBT rights in Japan. But this student wasn't part of the LGBT group that had been set up by the academics. It was supposed to be led by students, but it wasn't. It was being led by the academics, who were then, ordering the students. So this student who was going to give this presentation wasn't a part of that group, but she wanted to give a presentation on LGBT rights anyway, which of course, fine, right? No problem with that. But some of these academics went completely crazy, then bullied the student and said, right, we have to vet everything that you are going to do in your presentation, even though the presentation had nothing to do with that group. So what they were doing is making everything about them. And so, I can understand that there may be flaws in the methodology, or not even flaws necessarily, but the evidence might not be there yet. And that it does take all sorts, that sometimes some people who are slightly excessive in narcissism and psychopathy and even Machiavellianism are indeed necessary. Nevertheless, I think that you can, these gauges, if you like, can be useful tools in understanding, not in diagnosing necessarily, but in understanding the motivations of, for lack of a better word, toxic people. I mean, what do you think?
When we did the groupthink article, it's the same thing, right? It's like, we came away saying, there's evidence here, and it certainly feels, it passes the face validity test, right? The Facebook validity test, right? Yeah. Facebook, no, not the Facebook face validity test, just face validity.
Yeah.
It seems to fit, right? And the same thing with the existential threat article that we did a deep dive on, right? There seems to be a fit there. I mean, I think this is the same way, that there seems, it feels intuitively like this is going somewhere, like, that this is a fruitful research, direction. So then also this white identitarian scale. And I also could not get that. I don't know so it's in a book. And so, it's in this, oh no, I lied. It's in a conference. Looks like conference proceedings or something, because it's got a date on it, so I couldn't access that either. But it does list, the article does list a question. There is a progressive conspiracy against white identity. And they try to make it clear, what it is and what it is not.
I can flesh that out a bit if you like.
Yeah.
So within okay, so the term alt-right is really problematic, because basically anybody can be labeled as alt-right. I've been labeled as alt-right, even though I measure reliably left-wing on social and economic issues. So being called alt-right, or even being called a conservative, sometimes can be just a meaningless throwaway term. However, in terms of what we would traditionally, 10 years have called like white supremacy groups, say like the KKK, the Nazis as well, any of those kind of groups that believe that there is something innately morally and intellectually, perhaps even physiologically superior about white people versus other races. Among those groups, there is a belief that I can give you the Nazi version, which is kind of the most common one, and it's quite scary how widespread this belief has become, actually, and how much it's resurgent recently, even within some anti-woke circles. So there is a belief that, in the first instance, when I say we, I don't believe any of this stuff. So, but I'm just, I'm trying to give you their argument. I don't agree with this argument. I will tear it to shreds later, but I'm going to articulate it. So they would say, do we know that white people are superior? They would say yes. And you would say, well, okay, how do you know that white people are superior? What evidence do you have? And they would then say, well, look at all of the various Nobel Prizes by race, look at where in recent history at least, most economic progress, most scientific progress has been driven, which in general are the safest parts of the world, essentially East Asia, but Tokyo. We can see they like Japan, by the way. They like the alt-right types tend to love Japan. They often point to Japan and they say, look, Japan's a very homogenous society, and that's one of the reasons why Japan is so successful. And so, yeah, they're arguing for the superiority of white people, which is evidenced in the various cultural and civilizational achievements of countries that have been predominantly white. So that's their evidence. They then think that in order to gain political capital, certain groups within predominantly white countries like the United States have deliberately brought in waves upon waves of immigrants. So they bring in waves and waves of immigrants. These people are, in their view, a drain to the economy on balance, but they're bringing them in anyway, even though it's creating criminal problems, they're a drain on the economy, so on and so forth, because that will keep them in power. So they're happy to damage the country in order to keep them in power. So that they're replacing the white working and middle classes, in other words, in order to keep a certain group of people in power. The certain group of people in power is, can you guess who they are? The group of people who are pulling the strings and then engineering all the manipulation of all of these ethnic minorities to come in. Come on. Who do they think they are? They think they're the Jews, often. So often it's Jewish elites are manipulating systems. They're damaging the countries they exist in because they have no kind of ties to those countries. They have ties to the Jewish religion or Israel or themselves as an ethnicity. And they're deliberately fucking up countries in order to keep themselves in power. That's the kind of the great replacement theory. And versions of this permeate through, but by no means all, but plenty of right-wing discourses. You can even get a version of it on Tucker Carlson, for example. He doesn't say Jews, but he does say that, for example, democratic elites are, so his one wouldn't necessarily be an anti-Semitic one because he doesn't say Jews, but he has certainly said stuff like the democratic elites are deliberately getting waves and waves of immigrants in to replace the white voters because the white voters will vote Republican, in order so the democratic elites can keep themselves in power. So that's a kind of a white identitarianism. It's a belief that first of all, there is such a thing as the white race, which is a dubious statement in and of itself, given the various historic, linguistic, religious, cultural, geographic barriers that have existed, and then intermingling that have existed between various groups of people who you might call white. But anyway, they believe that one, there is such a thing called white, which I don't, not in a meaningful sense anyway. Two, that there is something special about white people. And three, that they need to be preserved as a consequence, even at the expense of other races, because they are superior. Now, what's really, really important here, and this is why, from an ideological point of view, this article seems to make so much sense, is that this assertion of kind of white identitarianism is often the same as authoritarian political correctness, like literally the same thing. So, for example, arguably the most famous and influential alt-right figure in America is a chap called Richard Spencer. Have you heard of him? Yeah, quite famous. And he espouses basically versions of what I've just said, right? He also will often share, like, and retweet posts by Ibram X. Kendi, who is arguably, I mean, if you go by book sales and things like that, speaking fees and how much money he's making, and is very arguably the most influential figure within critical social justice there is right now. And the two basically agree with each other, right? Whereas Ibram X. Kendi would say, well, look at all these civilizational achievements that white people have made. And he'd say that happens. They have elevated themselves into a position of power over other people. All of this has happened. Spencer is absolutely correct about that. But he would argue that it doesn't show any superiority. It shows a moral deficiency in white people, which again is a ridiculous thing to say. But if you look at that from an evolutionary point of view, if you were to say that, okay, we're just looking at an organism, let's call that organism white people, and let's say everything that they've said is true, then it wouldn't really matter whether that success had come out of some kind of moral deficiency or some kind of superiority, because they would be the same thing. They would be adaptive qualities, right? In an organism, if what they were saying was true, and I don't think it is, but if what they were saying was true, they would be essentially agreeing with each other. It doesn't matter whether you subjectively opine it to be malign or benign. The fact is that it has happened, and that quality for white people must be adaptive if everything else you're saying is true, which just shows how incoherent the whole critical social justice lot are, because they basically, no, but it's true, because they basically are making the same argument as the alt-right are, albeit just putting a very, 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 very subtly different label on it. And I should be clear when I say this. When I'm saying, I put Kendi, who is an academic, I put him in the advocate group, right? I don't think he's a very nuanced thinker. His arguments are incoherent. I don't think he's very well read. I'm not saying that he's the same as somebody like a Murray Masda or a Charles Mills or someone like that, who I would disagree with on a number of levels, but wouldn't come out with arguments that puerile. But you would have to say, nevertheless, he is arguably the most influential person in critical social justice because of his book sales, the number of people who read him. And he's essentially arguing the same thing as the alt-right types do. So that draws the line between white identitarianism and political PC authoritarianism.
So I was just going to say that, they say we define it here as a set of political attitudes characterized by strong feelings of white identity, solidarity, and a belief in white victimization.
Yeah.
Now, given everything you just said, we're not getting around to the article yet, but that's okay. Given everything you just said, so let me ask you a question. Is there an Asian identitarianism? Is there a Jewish identitarianism? Is there a Black identitarianism?
Yeah.
And should we consider, like, for example, if we were going to replicate this study, which we're getting around to talking about, would we want to measure those and consider those?
Yes, although, again, if you want to look at ethnic minorities within the alt-right or within critical social justice, they basically don't exist. They're all white. The best empirical.
But I'm just saying, so let's just replace this,
right.
with, feelings of a Jewish identity, Jewish solidarity, and a belief in Jewish victimization. Feelings of, how about gender? Feelings of gender identity, gender solidarity, and gender victimization. So I think that there is, and so I guess I just mentioned that because when we eventually get to the findings, I think that's very relevant. And, to the consideration of the relationships that they got here.
So would, for example, if we looked at a group of black people, a sample of black people, would those who, there would be some black people who would measure strongly in ethnic identitarianism, black identitarianism, and there would be some that don't so much and some that don't at all. Would the ones who very strongly identify with their race, would they be higher in psychopathy as well? You'd have to presume so, wouldn't you? If the findings of this are correct, you'd have to presume they would.
That's one of the things, like if we were talking to students, right? One of the things that I would say to my students is, even if we don't, let's not be overly critical of the article without also, we can criticize the article. Let's also think about what if some, let's just, choose something like what you just said. What if that aspect of these findings is accurate, does turn out to, does hold out over time, or turns out to be, really relevant, in future research and stuff. What could that mean? And that's what you just pointed out, right? What could that mean? Well, that could mean,
I'm willing to have a stab at that.
Okay, yeah.
I'm going to say what that could mean and what I think it does mean, and this is me going full on ideological. This is holding my hands up and saying that I am a liberal ideologue, right? Not liberal in the way that Americans think of liberal, which just means left wing, but liberal in the way that academics think of what liberal means. I believe in the liberal project. I believe in liberal democracies. I believe in the kind of societies in which are the most tolerant, diverse, prosperous that have ever existed, such as America and the UK and Japan and so forth. I believe that ethnic, gender, sexual identitarianism is poison by and large. I think that, that there's an adaptive side to it because it helps you have a community, but I think that there are better ways to form communities, such as a local knitting club, for example, where you identify with your love of knitting, or a book club, or a football team. There is a positive aspect with any kind of identitarianism. It does give you a community, and that's helpful. But I think that history has shown us that when we seek to draw arbitrary ethnic divisions between people and try to reify them, try to make them real, to make them more than they are, right? British people exist because they have a British passport and they're different from Americans. And there might be some cultural differences, but are the similarities more important than the differences? With human beings, I think beings are...
And there's this aspect of whatever that group is, their victimization.
Yes.
And so that's that aspect of it. So I don't think we can ever get away from, again, as human beings, the world is so complicated, right? I mean, all day long, we have to group things into good for me, bad for me, dangerous, not dangerous, someone, friend or foe, and red light, green light, do I want, all that kind of, all day long. And so I don't think we can ever get away from that, that sort of grouping, that there's a difference between sort of identity and identitarianism, I guess, in terms of this, our discussion here, that, there's this grouping, and then there's this belief that our group has been systematically victimized, or is currently systemically victimized, right? And so I don't know if the knitting group or the book club would necessarily inspire that same.
You'd be surprised, I think. Have you like you can imagine like a community center, right, where there's like a group of elderly people, and they're all kind of vying over each other, like who's going to get the room we want to have this from this day, and then there's somebody who's working as a kind of receptionist who's basically in her spare time trying to figure out, okay, we'll put them here this time, this time. I guarantee you that feelings of victimization would arise and probably conflict from them. I bet you we could find examples of that pretty quickly and pretty easily. I mean, human beings love to feel like victims, don't they?
Yes. Yes. And so I definitely want to come back to that when we talk about the results of this study, right? So, so what did they find? Well, they found that aspects of the Dark Triad significantly predicted. So, and by predicted, we don't mean an experiment, right? We mean correlation. So people answered these as surveys. The correlations between white identitarianism, and so obviously only the people who self-identified as Caucasian were included in that analysis. Okay, and I'm sure we have the N on that. I don't know how many offhand. How many of each do we know?
I don't have the paper.
I actually don't know
in front of me.
The number.
I think it was 200 and...
Yeah, we have 243 males, 268 females. I don't see the...
For the Caucasian group?
I do not. Do you?
I need to pull it up.
I see the coding.
Where am I?
But I don't see how many we have.
I can't see it either.
So Machiavellianism significantly predicted or was significantly correlated with white identitarianism. Narcissism, not as much. Machiavellianism was the highest. And then psychopathy, not correlated. And then when they did another round, so they're doing hierarchical linear modeling here, they found when they entered the entitlement in, that actually, as I mentioned, highly correlated with narcissism. And in fact, the entitlement measure sort of sucked out the effect of narcissism. So now when entered into the model, Machiavellianism, narcissism, psychopathy, and entitlement, we only have Machiavellianism and entitlement left in the model, predicting white identitarianism. So, so now to your question, before we go on to the politically correct subscales. So, would you think then that, if we took another identitarian, gender knitting book club, counsel for aging, whoever, do you think that relationship would be preserved, that Machiavellianism and entitlement would be significantly correlated with whatever form of identitarianism?
I would guess yes. Yes. Provided that those groups felt like they were endangered. That they felt that they were under some kind of existential threat. Not necessarily, they were being victimized. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I totally...
What do you think? You agree?
I totally agree. Yeah, I agree. People who would score higher in entitlement and people who scored higher on Machiavellianism, regardless of the identitarianism scale, these fictitious scales that we just made up, I would think that it would predict, they would, be correlated with one another. And let me just say that these correlations are, they're significant, right? But they don't explain a lot of the variance. So, so we have, we would have to square these in order to get the amount of variance explained. And it's, we don't want to get overexcited here. Okay. Now, the the PC authoritarianism, we have a similar kind of situation here where we have the correlations, but when they did the hierarchical linear modeling, we have the Machiavellian, the Dark Triad, all three of those, Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy, all significant in the model predicting PC authoritarianism. And then, however, when they entered, and by the way, narcissism was the strongest, although it's close, right? Then when they entered the entitlement aspect in there, then it became the only two significant were the entitlement and the psychopathy. So essentially the combination of psychopathy and entitlement sort of sucked out the effects of the narcissism and the Machiavellianism. So we have a slightly different, a little different pattern there, where Machiavellianism is the strongest, and then entitlement for the identitarianism, but the entitlement and psychopathy for the authoritarianism. And they do mention that the authoritarianism is associated with, more aggressive acts, right? That's the marker, right? Where it's, a desire, the attitude's primarily concerned with aggression, willingness to use aggression and force to achieve the ideological goals. So that kind of makes sense then, right?
Here's a question for you. If you had a choice between using force or kind of coercion, like aggressive language, that kind of behavior, or Machiavellianism to achieve your aim, which one would you go for?
So I'm pretty sure that I'm more Machiavellian.
Yeah, me too. And just this conversation has really brought out actually that kind of dark triad aspect in myself. Not in a way where I've been dishonest or I've misled people or I've lied, right, or I've done anything like that. I've not lied. I've not tricked.
Right. But that sort of laying in wait kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I see when I've come up against these people, I know exactly how they're going to behave. And a lot of the time, the psychopathy, the kind of the aggressive reaction, I've known exactly how they're going to react. And so I'm not tricked or lied or misled or done anything like that. But because I know what they're going to do, I've made sure that I make sure everybody can see what they're doing. Do you know what I mean? Right. So there are certain ways.
Well, yeah, and you're patient and you wait for them to trip themselves up.
Correct. Which is Machiavellian.
And that's very Machiavellian. And I was thinking, the reason I answered that way was because, from being canceled, my, it's sort of like, my significant other would say, go after them, get in their face and everything. And one of the things I kept saying was, I want them to never know the next time it's going to happen. So I want nothing. I want them to relax and then have something happen, and then relax and then have something happen, and then realize they can never relax.
See, this is the point.
And that's Machiavellian, right?
But it might also be justice.
I don't even know that I've been successful at doing that, but it's sort of like, I want that. It's like, that's my fantasy, is that there's that you can't ever forget, because you never know when I'm going to remind you of that, that was intellectual, right? What you did was, was against, academic freedom. It was against, freedom of speech. It was against research in general, which is everything that academics supposedly stand for. What you did was to to harm all of those things. And I want to keep reminding you at random times. And that is very Machiavellian. That's why I answered that way.
But it's, yeah, no, fine. But this is why the concept of Machiavellianism really needs some work. And this is what I started off with by saying that, you know, calling Machiavellianism necessarily a dark triad trait is... It's like, I could see how it could be, right? So, for example, I mean, some of the things that have happened to me that would be Machiavellian and I would say are bad. Like when I had somebody at my university say that I was, you know, despite having a gay sister who's married, I went to her wedding and lots of gay friends and all kinds of no problems there. Just out of the blue, inventing that I was a homophobic psychopath who had bullied students on campus for being gay and sabotaged gay events, which never happened. It's not like an exaggeration or he's a bit right-wing or he's all right. That's just completely like out of nowhere. But, you know, people believe that stuff, right? And then if you go and tell people these lies, that's a kind of Machiavellianism that is manipulative in this, but manipulative in an unjust kind of way, right? You're using deceit, subterfuge in order to get your own way. So I can see why that definitely should be labeled as a dark triad kind of behavior, because you're sabotaging people, but also you're sabotaging institutions because you're creating problems for people who might very well have something to add. Maybe not me, but somebody else, and the individual was doing similar things to other people who were also innocent, right? So I can see that way that would be a dark triad. But then also Machiavellianism might be broadly synonymous with the very Christian virtue of turning the other cheek.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, when these people went after me, and I literally straight out of the Bible turned the other cheek, you know, okay, I'm not a racist. I'm sorry if you felt that way. I did not intend for you to feel that way. And I feel that it is unfair for you to claim that you know my own mind better than I do. You're entitled to your opinion, and I'm glad you feel comfortable expressing it, but it's not true. You do not know my own mind better. So it's very, very firm. I held my ground, but I was very, very polite and measured in everything that I said. This was turning the other cheek. I wasn't lashing out at them. And I knew... And I've done this a few times with them. I know what they'll do next. They'll get more and more frustrated, and eventually they'll go crazy and start throwing F-bombs and calling me all kind of names under the sun because they can't get through with their kind of, they want me to kind of fold, or they want me to start throwing punches, or, the verbal equivalent, start calling them all fucking idiots and that kind of thing. But if I don't do that, if I just keep restating my position in a calm, logical and polite way, I know that they will explode. It always happens. They get completely frustrated, and then they just reveal themselves to be who they are, which is a bunch of bullies. That's kind of Machiavellian, right? Because in a sense, I'm manipulating them, because I know I'm getting them to behave in a certain way. And I knew, I know this is how you're going to behave, and I'm going to manipulate you into behaving this way. I knew that from the start, but I'm not doing it in a dishonest way. I'm not telling them that I know that they're going to behave in this way.
Yeah. Not holding up a sign.
No, but at the same time, I'm not bullying them. I'm not lying to them. I'm not lying to anybody else. I'm not bullying anybody else. I'm just, holding my cards a little bit close to my chest and not responding with anger and not responding in this kind of way that they want me to do. Should that be regarded as a dark triad thing? I would argue no. I would argue that's perfectly reasonable. In fact, that's arguably the most ethical way of dealing with things, right?
Absolutely. So then when we get to PC, the libertarian kind of version, we get... in the regression model, we get psychopathy as negatively predictive, right? And in fact, then when they enter the entitlement, nothing happens. It's still psychopathy as negatively predictive in the model. So basically, there's nothing going on in that PC liberal, kind of...
which is us, because we're...
not too much going on there. So... nothing in the Dark Triad or the except for psychopathy but negatively predictive was useful in the model. So I don't know. How do you feel about that? Let me ask you this. What would you put in the model that you would think would predict that?
I would, for PCA, those two questions are not nearly subtle enough. It's like they're kind of the more Machiavellian.
Well, no, PCL for PCL.
Oh, for the PCL?
Yeah, they already mentioned that some other personality traits might be relevant, right? Like openness to experience,
agreeableness would be in PCL,
and agreeableness, perhaps, which is that makes sense because psychopaths, psychopathy would be
obviously
less so. But I'm just wondering about other kinds of. I'm not saying that I had thought of anything, but I'm just asking if you had thought of anything you were wondering, so nothing predicts it. What might?
Well, PCL is kind of vanilla, isn't it? It's like the standard. It's like what most people believe.
Boring.
No, not boring. I think PCL is under threat. PCL being basically liberalism, right? So, there's this kind of for example, people would often say, when I argue against authoritarian political correctness, so when I argue against people saying, you ask me where I'm from, therefore that's a racist statement, you're trying to other me, and I'd say, no, maybe he just wanted to know where you're from. That's perfectly legitimate. Right?
It could happen, it's just
happens all the
conversation
time. Starter. Or in my case, when I said somebody was very, very, their English was excellent, apparently I meant the opposite of that.
Oh.
No, I actually genuinely meant that your English was excellent. I wasn't trying to other or alienate you in any way whatsoever. You said person in question said her English wasn't good enough. And I was just like, no, wow, it's really amazing. Apparently that was othering. No, it's, it often, maybe sometimes it might be, don't know, can't speak for everybody, but certainly in my case, and I'd be fairly confident in predicting in the vast majority of cases where people make statements like that, it's not an indication of racism, othering, or any other such bigotry. But with the authoritarian types, when they demand, no, I need validation, I can assume that it is, the concept of microaggression. When I argue against that, then that is often in itself seen as a form of bigotry, right? So the kind of the political correctness liberalism is quite different. Like the liberal political correctness, I'd actually quite agree with. I don't believe that people should be jumping and alleging things without evidence, which is the authoritarian thing. But just because I argue against that, it doesn't follow that I don't think that people shouldn't say nasty things to one another. I don't want to offend anybody. I don't want to go around burning Qurans. I don't want anyone to get a... No. Because I say I don't think somebody should be arrested for burning a Quran, and I genuinely don't, doesn't mean I think a person should burn a Quran. It's not the same statement, right? But often it's presented that way, like, oh, you're arguing against the authoritarianism, that means you're in favor of burning Qurans. No, I don't want it to be illegal. Definitely shouldn't do it. It's not a great idea. And I'm not talking about it's not a great idea from a consequential point of view, right? I'm not talking about, people go crazy and attack you or try and burn your house down. That might happen too, but it's not a good idea from that viewpoint too. But simply from the consequences on other people, you shouldn't do it because you shouldn't want to hurt other people's feelings, and unless you absolutely have to. In some cases you do have to, but for the most part you don't. And if you can avoid hurting other people, then avoid hurting other people. And the reason why you're against kind of the authoritarian side of it is because, as you can clearly see with the concept of microaggressions, if you've ever been on the receiving end of a bogus allegation, which by now we either all have or are living in fear of, it's a tyranny of the subjective where people can just make shit up, accuse you, punish you, and then try and claim status as a consequence. I'm against that. I'm not against being nice to people. Of course we should be nice to one another. So that's why I'm a PC liberal. And I think that's most normal people. I don't...
Well, and so from that perspective, so here's what I would sort of I feel like sort of came out of what you just said, which is that, as you said, like most people are probably this PC liberal, right? And so if the majority, to go back to your example of sort of the normal curve, right? Where's the center, right? And sort of you get, the most people are sort of piled up in the center of the normal curve, right? Most scores, most people are all there, if we think about the diversity of people's personalities, their ideology, their interests, whether it's knitting or the ages,
learning crafts,
or their gender, there would be a lot more diversity where there's a larger group,
of
right?
course,
and where we would have maybe the more extremes. Maybe there would be a little bit less diversity because there are fewer in the tails of the distribution. It's possible that some of these kinds of things might predict those tails a little bit better than they would predict the masses, I guess. And so while I'm not ready to, swallow this hook, line, and sinker, I'm certainly willing to consider the possibility. I'm still, however, of the opinion that it doesn't help us much in the fight, in quotes, or the efforts to push back, because we can't identify people simply just based on, what we think their personality is, or even, based on a few questions or whatever. So I'm not sure how useful it is, except that it's maybe it just makes those of us who've, been on the receiving end feel a little bit better. But I don't.
I don't think you're nearly as Machiavellian as you ought to be. Of course, once we know thyself and know thy enemy, and you'll never lose in 1,000 battles, the famous Chinese general Sun Tzu said. Get the psychological profile of the enemy and exploit it.
Yeah.
No, I think from my perspective, I think that they're on to something. I don't think, we've gone through the problems with psychopathy, like, demonstrably not all psychopaths are bad people. You can be a psychopath and be an extremely not even productive, hero.
This is not being a psychopath. This is scoring higher on a psychopathy scale. That is these are very
okay.
different.
Let me.
You see what I'm saying? Like, not being you're not a narcissist. You score if you score higher on a narcissism scale.
But I'm trying to take issue with the term.
I know I'm being nitpicky.
Okay, you're saying Dark Triad. Invariably, most people who are wartime heroes, let's say, like I don't know, an American like Nelson. Nelson, Lord Admiral Nelson. Never mind, you're not English. Eisenhower. Now, Eisenhower, right?
Yes.
A war hero. Somebody who, was very, very important in winning the Second World War against the Germans, right? And yet would have had to have made lots of difficult decisions under a huge amount of pressure, and sent lots of young men to their deaths. Possibly civilians to their deaths as well, by choosing who to defend and who not to defend. Lots of awful decisions to be made every day for somebody like that, right? And yet we rightly regard a man like that as a hero, because the evil that he prevented was much, much greater than any evil he had to do in order to prevent that evil from becoming, all powerful. But, I think if you and I were to jump in a TARDIS and go back to the 1940s or whatever and sit Eisenhower down, take a break from fighting the Japanese and the Germans just for a second. Just want to run you through this questionnaire.
Yeah.
As one does. Don't worry, we've got a time machine, okay? You're not going to lose it, If we were to do that, then I think you probably would score very highly, quite highly.
I think
chances
you're
right.
I think you're right.
So what I want to say is that we are not necessarily, when I say that the authors, I think they're onto something, and we've been through the problems with Machiavellianism as well, when it could actually be the same thing as being Christian, for example, and turning the other cheek. philosophically speaking, not even psychologically speaking, because I think this is a philosophical problem. Philosophically speaking, these terms need more work. And, you know, as you say, you can never get anything so it corresponds perfectly with reality, because that's just too complicated. But you nevertheless can say meaningful things. I think your authors are already saying meaningful things. I think with a bit more philosophical work on the definitions, and let's not call it Machiavellianism, for example, let's change that term and let's make it more robust philosophically. The same with narcissism and psychopathy. I think that we could get more out of that. So they're onto something. Let's work on the terms philosophically. Let's test them in a more robust way according to psychology.
But then
and there's
again,
10 years of research.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Yeah. Anybody listening who wants to do their dissertation on, on this, and, but I still do get back to, it's not too useful in, an ideological discussion to say, oh, I bet you score high on psychopathy.
No, it's not.
I mean,
no, but from a Machiavellian point of view, it is. So, like, the fact that I kind of predicted, like, I read this paper a few years ago, and it informed my tactics and how I fight woke people. And because I was reasonably confident that the people I was going up against were often a little bit on the kind of psychopathic side, I used that against them. And it seemed to work quite well. Like, again, turn the other cheek, don't say anything, don't show any emotion, just, be polite all of the time, don't get into a fist fight with them, hold your position, try to stay as calm as you can, and keep asserting your position. Repeat yourself if necessary. Rebut whatever they say, but never lose it. But that informed my approach.
Right. So I guess you're right. If you're sort of in a position where you need to push back against something, if it makes us feel, if it helps us formulate our response, then there is value in it. It feels divisive sometimes to me to talk about personality, but from that perspective, you're right. If we're sort of using it just to think about, other people and the way in which, if we truly use these kinds of things to think about how to interact with people in the best way possible, then it is completely useful. I agree.
Right. So, I mean, what I'm saying is it's a different, by understanding the psychological profile of the person you're engaging with. And I'm not saying that, by the way, the evidence doesn't suggest that all people who believe in are like
no
this.
Means. Not even close.
By no means. And actually, as I said at the beginning, most of the scholars that I know who really understand this are not like this at all. It's the advocates who claim to be scholars and are often academics but aren't really scholars. They're the ones in my anecdotal experience who tend to be like this. But, if you have a psychological profile of a person who is like that, and you can develop one from the literature, then I have used it to some effect. And it would be completely different.
I think even if it's not, even if it's not true, if it helps us formulate arguments that end up, advancing the cause, or maybe just, slowing an assault or something like that, even if it's not true, it's useful. It's useful as a perspective taking device. How's that? But even if it's not perfectly, again, even if it's not all that predictive, any sort of tool that helps us take another perspective, I think is valuable.
But I think I don't know it's true, all of the kind of usual caveats aside. I think it probably is true. I think narcissism and psychopathy are in there. I think, Machiavellianism, I'm not so sure about.
I don't think we should.
I'm just going anecdotal. Yeah.
I don't think we should do it tonight because we're already like over an hour, but maybe we should talk about, the other article.
The virtue signaling.
About the virtuous victimhood and the Dark Triad. So maybe we should do that next week.
That sounds absolutely delicious. All right. So to conclude, Philosophically, I think we agree that there is some work that could be done in these dark triad terms, but that there might very well be something in there. I think Elizabeth's kind of 57% confident there's something in there roughly. I'm more towards the 70%. This is because I'm into ideology and she's into psychology, which just kind of dictates different ways in which our brains work. But hopefully you've got a perspective from both sides, and you can agree with us entirely, agree with me entirely if you like, or Elizabeth entirely, or you can think we're both full of crap. I hope it's been an interesting discussion. So yeah, I think there's something in it. Next week, we are going to continue the discussion on the Dark Triad. Hopefully we won't rehash everything, but we'll have to rehash a bit, just to kind of, so that you don't forget and we don't forget. And we'll look at victimhood. So in both...
Very different article, very different investigatory measures, and experimental, as opposed to correlational. Ooh. So that's, I'm always into the, experimental. There's six or eight studies in this paper. So they wow. Yeah, they went to town.
Right. So I will endeavour to read that. I read the title, and so therefore I'm very confident to talk about it a little bit and say that it's about the Dark Triad, the Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and narcissism, and how that correlates with being a victim or pretending to be a victim, as is common, as this article established, but as you probably know if you've talked to any of these people, as is very common among critical social justice advocates who claim to be either a victim or on the side of victims, the authentic victims, but also the alt-right types who believe that white people are being targeted by the Jews, reptiles, whatever, and that they're trying to be replaced as if white people exist, but never mind. But yeah, they believe that they're victims. So we're going to look at those psychological traits in regards to victimhood or pretended victimhood. Good. All right. Thank you very much. See you next week. Bye.
Bye.